to talk about two big subjects, Islam and worldview. It is, what is the worldview of the Islamic religion? What is the worldview that the second largest religion in the world holds? How does Islam and those who follow Islam understand the world around them?
There's not a time zone in which he's not being praised. Listen to me, there is not a moment since the resurrection of Jesus where there's not someone somewhere declaring that Jesus saved.
As a Christian, it is my desire and goal to be able to effectively share the gospel with anyone and everyone. In my community, I've noted recently that we have a number of families moving in from Middle Eastern countries who are Muslim. They appear to be great neighbors, very kind, very nice. My interactions with them, we've had pleasant conversations. But I want to be able to have an opportunity to have an ongoing conversation about the gospel and share the good news of Jesus Christ with them. To do that, I need to understand their worldview, because they may say something and I'm saying something, and I think we're saying the same thing, but we could be saying something entirely different. For example, most people will tell you that Christians, Muslims, and Jews all worship the same God. That is simply not true. In fact, when you press in and you find a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian who really know what they're talking about and want to dig in a little deeper, they're all three going to acknowledge that no, they don't worship the same God. And I'll get into why in just a minute. But I just want to remind you that I recommended last time James Sire's book. That's Sire, S-I-R-E, The Universe Next Door. And he gives you the 7 basic worldview questions. I want to hit his definition again one more time before we get into Islam. I'm hoping that we can cover really all of the 7 questions and how Islam would answer those 7 questions in this episode. But if not, don't worry, we'll catch it in the next one. Also hoping to cover Hinduism and Buddhism in some future episodes of The Brief as we look through these 7 questions, because they're not... When I look in my neighborhood, I don't just have Muslims living in my neighborhood. I also now have recognized I have some Hindus living in my neighborhood and want to be effective in sharing the gospel with them as well. So let's go back over this definition. I think it's a great definition. There's a number of variations, but this one's extremely helpful. Sire says that a worldview is essentially this. It's a commitment. It's a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed in a story or a series of presuppositions which we hold about the basic constitution of reality and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. If you want to hear a little more where I unpack that definition and deal with the details, you just want to go to the previous episode where I give kind of an overview and touch on a Christian worldview. Let me hit these 7 questions and kind of walk through how Islam would seek to answer these 7 questions. First of all, what's the prime reality? In other words, what is ultimate reality? What's really real? What is the nature of external reality? What is a human being? Where do we go after death? How is it possible to know anything at all? How do we know what is right and wrong? And what's the meaning of human history? Now, Islam, like Judaism, is closely related to Christianity in a number of ways. There's going to be some aspects of our worldview that we share. Of course, as we dig a little deeper on any one of these questions, we'll notice some nuances, okay? Let me, before we jump into these questions, I just want to point out a couple resources I think are extremely helpful. So we have The Life of Muhammad, published here. This is extremely helpful. Many people think if you want to study Islam that you start with the Quran. I would suggest that you not, because the Quran, it can be difficult, especially if you're used to the way the Bible's structured. The Quran is structured a lot different. And two, the Quran it claims to be the revelation of Allah or God. However, you need to understand something about Islam. Islam may appear to an outsider to be centered on Allah. The problem is that, according to Islam, Allah is not knowable in the sense of we think about having a personal relationship. Christians use that terminology, a personal relationship with God. That's not something that is part of Islam, at least fundamental or historical Islam. So at the center of Islam is Muhammad. Now, if you've noticed something within Islamic circles, if you criticize Muhammad, you'll get an instantaneous response by many Muslims, not all, but by many, and you almost kind of expect it as a default. If you criticize Muhammad, you will get a visceral response by many, or at least and even for those who wouldn't give you a visceral response, you will probably get a negative response. And you think, why is that? Well, because at the center of Islam is truly Muhammad. And I think if you're going to start, you want to start with the life of Muhammad. And that's what we have here in the Life of Muhammad translated. And this is really a translation of Ibn Hisham's work and Ibn Ishaq, a couple key people within Islamic history. If you think about it, really, these are the key people. So you have here Bin Ishaq is essentially, that means the son of. So you have Muhammad, son of Ishaq, who is writing this material, or at least, excuse me, he's the source of the material, and I believe it's yeah. So Ibn Ishaq, we think of in the Hebrew it's Ben, but in Islam it's Ibn Ishaq is the source material, but Ibn Hisham is the one writing it. This is the biography of Muhammad's life from the earliest sources. And I think it's important that we start here if we're going to try to answer any of these questions, because Muhammad is the key focus. And it's absolutely essential that you understand that if you're going to try to understand the worldview of Islam. And so the Sirah means the biography. That's where you would start. I also want to point out that there's another book that I think would be really helpful in Ibn Warwick. This is, it's not his real name. He uses this name, I think, probably for protection. So you can imagine if you're writing and you're being critical of Islam, you're going to have some pushback there, depending on what country you live in. That pushback could even cost you your life. So he has a book called The Quest for the Historical Muhammad by Ibn Warwick. Really good. A number of things just jump out. I think it's a good scholarly dive into some questions about the historicity of Muhammad. And then you have the Quran, which this one's an extremely large Quran that I have here in my hands, and that's because it's the equivalent of what we would call like a study Bible, and it's paralleled. So you have on the one side you have the Arabic, and on the other side you have the English. Of course, Muslims will say you can't translate the Bible, or excuse me, you can't translate the Quran. They would say what is in English is an interpretation. I appreciate that, and I respect that, especially when we think about the worldview of Islam. They hold the Quran to be the Word of God. Christians hold the Bible to be the Word of God. But we get into debates within Christianity about translations. And one of the things that I know is that it's impossible to perfectly translate from one language to another. So really, all translations truly are, in a sense, interpretations. However, this is an English translation of the Arabic. And then on the bottom, there's a series of study notes. And one of the things that I've noticed over the years in reading the Quran and some of the secondary resources is that frankly, without the study notes, the Quran would not support, if you will, we would say is historical Islam, the way Islam is historically understood. Islam is historically understood from the biographies, or the biography, the Sirah of Muhammad, and then by the Hadith, or the sayings of the Prophet, whether you go to the two major sources from Muslim or Bukhari. Those are the two major sources of his life. And in the Quran, the notes, kind of the study notes, help you understand how these obscure passages that otherwise would make no sense to an outsider just picking it up. They offer these commentary notes of explaining what appears to me to be contradictions and a story that doesn't really have any continuity. It feels like just a bunch of random things that are being smashed together at times. So now that we've got kind of those basic, let's talk about this. What's ultimate reality in Islam? Well, it would be Allah, because He is transcendent. What we mean by transcendent is, we might say, utterly other. So He can't be bound, if you will, by space and time. And even in Islam, so He has no form or no body. Of course, now you're going to understand why Islam's going to push back against the doctrine of the incarnation. So as you're talking about Jesus and believe in Jesus, you have to understand at the very core, the foundational question, Islam is going to go over and against this. You say, but how does it work in Christianity? Because within a Christian worldview, we believe the ultimate reality, yes, is God, but we're not saying the same things. Do we believe that God is transcendent? Yes. Do Muslims? Yes. But we also believe that God is immanent or near, and we also believe that God is personal. Why? Because we believe in a triune God. As Christians, one being, three persons. Islam would be one being, one person. If we would even use the word person, it would be irrelevant to even use that. So you just one being. Now, when you think about that, that removes personality, and you'll see that in Islam. So let's think about this for just a minute. Now, I think it's certainly fair to criticize any religion, and to criticize Islam is okay. Even, I see a number of people hesitant, but let's talk about this, okay? So when I said that Muhammad is the central figure within Islam, right, and that his biography and then the sayings and the actions of Muhammad as allegedly recorded in the Hadith collections, whether Muslim, Bukhari, and there's a number of others, but these are just the two major ones. So if you have a God, now answer to question number one, what is ultimate reality? A God who is transcendent but not knowable in the sense of you think about, well, they say, well, God's merciful, he's all merciful. Well, those are characteristics, but can you know him? If you can't know him and there's a lack of personality, you need a figure with personality that you can know. There you insert Muhammad. That's why it's extremely important for Muslims to know what Muhammad did in a situation, how he handled a situation. That's how you get Sharia law. Most people don't understand Sharia law. You don't go to the Quran per se to get Sharia law, although you do in many respects. I'm not saying that you don't, but that's not really where you start. In understanding Sharia law, you need to understand that Sharia law is based on the sayings and practices of Muhammad. So in Islam, he's the ideal person. Now, some might say he's the perfect person. Some Muslims might say that. Certainly the hadiths do not back that up. Neither does the Sirah, neither does the Quran back this up, the idea that he would be perfect. But let's say this, within Islam, let's be fair, Muhammad would be considered the ideal person. So if he's the ideal person, if he's the quote-unquote final prophet, according to Islam, then you need to look at every area of his life. And then that's how you structure law, or how everyone else should live, thus Sharia law. So think about this. In Christianity, you would have this, and it's silly. What would Jesus do? I don't think that's how we should be analyzing the Bible. Talking about what would Jesus do. I think we need to talk about what did Jesus command, because in the Great Commission it says, teach them to observe all that I've commanded you. Certainly we want to imitate Christ, but that's not our starting point. Our starting point is to do what Christ said, and then certainly imitate to the fullest extent possible underneath the command. That is, we do what we're told by Christ. Now, if you go to Islam and you need law, then you would say this, well, what would Muhammad do? Now, truly within Islam, that is truly the core when you think about Islamic law. What would Muhammad do? And that's going to help us answer some of these other worldview questions. What would Muhammad do? Well, you say, well, how would I know? Guess what? They have this entire, you're talking about volumes and volumes and volumes, multiple sources of these called hadiths that are allegedly the things Muhammad said and did, and then they've got these succession of people that it came from. We could spend a whole episode critiquing that. Like so-and-so heard it from so-and-so, heard it from so-and-so, heard it from so-and-so, heard it from so-and-so, that the prophet said this. And they've got that recorded line, and of course you've got sometimes multiple generations, and everyone's memory was apparently perfect, whatever. The point is this. Ultimate reality is a God who's transcendent in Islam, but not knowable the way we understand knowability. Therefore, you need Muhammad. Number two, what's the nature of external reality? Well, they would also say, well, God created everything, and so your relationship to God is to submit to Him and that all creation should submit to him. Of course, Islam is geopolitical. That is, they don't separate the sacred and the secular. I don't think that the Bible does either. I don't think that Christianity should. Modern versions of weak, kind of woke Christianity separate the sacred from the secular, like just keep it in the church house. It has no application in government or life. I reject that. I think Christianity is also geopolitical, but Islam certainly is not only geopolitical, but it's still practice. So it's fundamentally geopolitical, but its practice is geopolitical. That is, there's no separation between religion, government. The sacred and secular always collide. So that means that the nature of external reality is that all of nature, all of humanity, every aspect of humanity should be submitted to Allah and His will. So that's when you're trying to understand Islam. We hear this, a radical Islam, radical Islam. You hear that word thrown around, but usually people have no idea what they're talking about. All you need is a talking head on Fox News to tell you that that was radical Islam. Well, actually, typically that's what we would call fundamental Islam. So I don't know who gave it the title radical. Radical Islam would be probably what you would see more in a progressive approach to Islam, more of a kind of ecumenical approach. That's more radical. Historically speaking, fundamental Islam is a belief that the Quran is the revelation of God, that Muhammad is the example, and that Sharia law should be imposed on every being on this planet. So when we think about that question, it's going to lead us to the third one. Do Muslims believe that humanity is created in the image of God? Well, according to Bukhari, this is again from the Hadith, that the Prophet had stated. Of course, if you want to know what Muhammad said, you're not going to find it in the Quran. Muslims will tell you that the Quran is not Muhammad speaking, it's God speaking. So if you want to hear from Muhammad, you have to go to the Hadith. He states, as Islam claims, as the prophet of God, that man was created in the image of God. Now, what does that mean? Well, a number of Islamic scholars are pointing out that, well, God doesn't have a body, so there's some clear differences here. So, of course, as Christians, we also believe that God is spirit and that He became a man. But it's important to distinguish here, because this is where Islam's going to draw the line, that God could not become a man. That's important. And I think we're going to have to work through that and think through that so that we can effectively engage Muslims, evangelize Muslims with the gospel. So we'll come back to that. What is a human being? Number 4, what happens to a person after death? Now you're going to find some similarities here, heaven or hell, how you get there between a Christian belief and a Muslim belief, entirely different. On the, if you will, within Christianity, the message is that you are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. In Islam, and this is, I'm not saying this, I have sat with Islamic scholars and asked this question. I've said, how can God be both just and justifier? How can He be just and merciful? And I sat and spent a number of hours and days with a Muslim scholar in Louisville, Kentucky, spent some time with a Sunni Muslim scholar and a Shiite Muslim scholar, trying to ask them. They both really had kind of the same answer here. Shiites are going to have some variations at times of some of these answers, but it was essentially this. It just depends on God. So when you stand before God, it's almost, in a sense, arbitrary. If he decides to be merciful, so be it. If He decides not, so be it. So you really don't know. So you're always striving to, really, I guess the only way that I found in Islam that you can have like a promise of heaven, like a certainty of heaven, is to die in a holy war, a jihad. That's the only, if you will, certain promise that Islam would give. Other than that, you would be uncertain. Certainly you would be trying to be a good person with the hope that you would go to heaven, or would say paradise. Anyway, much more to say on that maybe another time. Why is it possible to know anything at all? Well, here there's probably going to be some nuance here. Of course, I've already mentioned that according to the Hadith, we have Muhammad saying that Islam At its core of Islam, there is a belief that man or humanity were created in the image of God. However, there's a distinction here. So knowledge, we think about this. So within Christianity, we would say that you have revelation and reason. And when they're put in their proper order, then we can know truth. So we wouldn't put reason, then revelation. We would put revelation, then reason. Faith seeking reason. So we would put them in that order. Revelation, then reason. And Islam is going to do the same thing. The difference is what we say is revelation. So, of course, they're going to say the Quran is revelation. And depending on who you're talking to, you're going to have a number of them who say, well, the Hadith is also revelation. There's different schools of thought there. So within Christianity, we say that the Bible's revelation. Now we're going to see the difference here. So when you think about this, how do we know anything at all? We both have a similar answer in that, God knows all things. We believe being created in the image of God, we have the ability to know. But to know truth, we're going to look at different sources. Now, some would say, well, then we could use the Quran to evangelize Muslims. You have something called the camel method. There's a number of criticisms towards the camel method, but any method is going to be criticized. The purpose of my podcast today is not to criticize it. I would like to ask a lot of questions about it. I know that there's some that say, well, if you could take the Jesus of the Quran, you can use the Quran to show that Isa, which is the name that he's given in Islam, that you can show that he's the Son of God. I don't think so. I think you can start to have a conversation there about what do you believe about Jesus, and then you can begin to ask questions, and with the opportunity, taking the opportunity, I hope, then to share the truth about Jesus that's revealed from the Holy Scriptures. I think one of the places you could start is you could talk about the character of God. And one of the things I think is important is when we think about this idea of for example, speech or knowledge or love. We think about any of these things. For example, let's use love and speech. Did God speak for the very first time when he spoke, if you're a Muslim, the Quran, or did he speak for the very first time, if you're a Christian, when he spoke the Bible? That would seem strange to me. So we recognize that God is a personal being because speech is communicating that they're persons. I think there's an argument to be made there. Won't belabor that point. But we could also say love. I mean, is the very first time that God, did he become loving, or was he always love? I think there's going to be some differentiating here now. We would say that he's always been love, but if you were the only person, then what's that you just simply, how do you express love if you are the only, if God's Unitarian? I think this, again, if you're just using reason, kind of a philosophical argument to establish the triunity of God. There's a number of other, I'm not trying to establish the triunity of God only on those points, but I think getting into these conversations and dialogues affords us the opportunity to say, okay, let me give you my answer, and then pointing to the Lord Jesus Christ. Number 6 and 7 quickly. How do we know what is right and wrong? I kind of already covered number 6 for Islam. How do you know what's right or wrong? You would be looking at Muhammad. You might think, well, we're going to the Quran to find what is right or wrong. Not necessarily. You could in some respects within Islam, but ultimately to find what is right or wrong, you must look at the life of Muhammad. Number 7, and of course, again, I want to go back and stress, that's the basis of Sharia law. What is the meaning of human history? You're going to find some similarities, that it's linear, but ultimately it's that the purpose of human history is to subject all of creation to the will of Allah. We would have a similar belief as Christians, but we would say this is that the, as I've always closed my podcast, the nations would be converted, that all creation would glorify God through the revelation of His Son Jesus Christ. It's going to be those are completely. We might say there's some similarities, but that's entirely different when you really press in on it. So I think this is important. It's important because if we're going to truly evangelize those around us, we have to take the time to kind of get to know what they believe. This has just been somewhat of an overview, walking through James Sire's 7 worldview questions. I think you can take these 7 worldview questions and analyze any belief system and be able to see some similarity, some differentiation, but it puts you in a proper orientation to be effective as an evangelist for Jesus Christ. Why? Because that's what we're called to do. We're called to take the gospel to the nations. We're told, go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations. Not make disciples in the nations, but disciple the nations. So until the nations are converted, there can be no excuses. We're going to continue to learn, continue to evangelize. There will be absolutely no retreat. We're going to press forward with the gospel and no surrender. No, we will not surrender even 1 square inch. Why? Because Jesus Christ is King. He's not just my King. He's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.